Welcome to episode 165 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It's April 14, 1900. Roker Park, Sunderland. A new ground, still raw by later standards. Wooden structures, open corners, the North Sea air never far away. And on a day when the wind matters as much as any player on the pitch, football produced something it had never seen in the league before. A goalkeeper scored, not from a penalty, not from a desperate charge in the last minute, not from a set-piece routine, but from his own kick. Manchester City's Charles Williams, playing into a gale that could turn a clearance into an event, launched the ball upfield, watched it carry and bounce towards Sunderland's goal, and then saw one of the great goalkeepers of the age, Ned Doig, fail to keep it out. City would still lose 3-1, but that is not why we remember the match. We remember it because on this day, Charles Williams became the first goalkeeper recorded as scoring in the Football League, and, as far as the record seems to show, very likely the first in first-class football as well. But how did we get here? By April 1900, the Football League was already deep into its formative years. This was its 12th season. League football was no novelty now. There had already been 4,500 matches and 16,000 goals. Forwards had scored them, inside men had scored them, halfbacks occasionally joined in, fullbacks might blunder into one, but not the goalkeeper. And that is not surprising. The game, by design, does not put goalkeepers in scoring positions. It didn't then, and it doesn't now. Tactically, keepers lived in their own world. Their first duty was survival, catching, punching, clearing, and organizing. Even in the rougher, less systematized football of the 1890s, the man in goal was separated from the act of scoring by both position and instinct. He was the last man, not the extra attacker. So the strange thing is not that no goalkeeper had scored before 1900. The strange thing is that sooner or later, one finally did. And to understand why it happened here, on this ground, in this match, you have to picture football as it still looked at the turn of the century. Roker Park had opened only in September 1898. It was new, but not new in the way we think of a modern stadium. It was built fast. The stands were wooden. The old clock stand had steps, no seats, and a crush barrier. This was not yet the later, more enclosed age. The famous Archibald Leitch version of Roker Park still belonged to the future. In 1900, this was still a ground where weather could play. And at Sunderland, weather really could play. This was Wearside. This was an exposed football environment. The wind got hold of the ball. It could turn an ordinary kick into an awkward, dipping, skidding problem. And that mattered on April 14, 1900, because Manchester City had their wind at their back in the first half. The match itself didn't come with title-deciding stakes. Sunderland was still one of the grand powers of English football, but this was not one of their championship seasons. They would finish third. City, newly established back in the first division after winning the second division the previous year, would finish seventh. There were still only a few games left in the campaign. In table terms, this was context rather than destiny. But the cast matters. Sunderland had Ned Doig in goal, one of the most distinguished keepers of his era, a Scottish international and a pillar of the old Sunderland machine. Manchester City had Charles Albert Williams. Williams was born in Welling, Kent, in November 1873. He came through local football, played for Phoenix and Erith, and then joined Woolwich Arsenal. In fact, when Arsenal entered the Football League in 1893, Williams was their goalkeeper in that first league campaign. A year later, he moved north to Manchester City, and there he became City's regular goalkeeper for 8 seasons. He was not a curiosity, not a reserve, not a one-day stand-in. He was an established professional, and by 1900, one of the known goalkeepers in the league. So when this happened, it happened to a real first-team keeper with a real career behind him. The match itself turned weird before the goal even arrived. Sunderland took the lead in the 25th minute through Jim Leslie. They were the better side often enough, and they then had a chance to double the advantage from the penalty. Here the age of football matters again. The penalty kick had only been introduced in 1891, and the modern penalty spot will not arrive until 1902. This was still a comparatively new, less settled mechanism in the game. According to the match details preserved, Matthew Ferguson's penalty had to become a whole sequence. He converted twice, and twice the kick had to be retaken because City defenders encroached. Weird. And then on the third attempt, he missed. Think about the emotional swing of that. What should have been 2-0 stayed 1-0. And then came the goal. Contemporary accounts make clear that the wind was central to it. Williams launched the ball downfield. One report says it traveled the length of the field without any other player touching it. It came toward Doig, bounced awkwardly, and the Sunderland keeper failed to keep it out. Some later summaries describe it as a drop kick, some as a goal kick, but the essential fact doesn't change. It's a long goalkeeper's kick, carried and complicated by the wind, and it ended in the net. 1-1. The newspapers treated it exactly as they should have treated it, as something extraordinary. The crowd, according to the local reporting, could barely process what they had seen. City's players, however, understood quickly enough and rushed to congratulate Williams. The same coverage stressed the novelty of the moment and treated it as a record, the kind of thing even seasoned football watchers had not previously encountered. There's another reason the moment lands so well in the imagination. It happened against Ned Doig. Not against a novice, not against a second-string keeper, but against one of the best-known goalkeepers in Britain. That is what made the image so powerful. A goalkeeper's kick, the whole length of the field, and a famous opposing keeper left helpless by the wind, the bounce, and the split-second failure together. Sunderland recovered. Billy Farquhar scored in the 86th minute. Bobby Hogg added another 2 minutes later. The final score was 3-1. In the table, that was the real business of the afternoon. But history kept the equalizer. So what? It was a genuine first. This was not just an amusing oddity rediscovered later. Contemporary newspapers already understood that something unprecedented had happened, and the historical record still points the same way. First goalkeeper to score in the Football League, and almost certainly the first known keeper to score in a first-class match. And it tells us something about football's physical world in 1900. The goal didn't necessarily change stadium design. That broader transformation was already in motion as professionalism deepened, crowds grew, and grounds became more substantial. But this moment sits right on that frontier. It belongs to a version of the game in which the stadium had not yet fully domesticated the elements. Roker Park was still young, still partly makeshift by later standards, still vulnerable to wind as an active force in the football itself. In other words, this was not only a freak goal, it was a period goal. A goal from a time when the sport was modern enough to have a league table, a transfer market, and regular professionals, but still old enough to let the weather rewrite the script. Finally, Charles Williams didn't remain just a trivia answer. His life after this made him one of the early carriers of football across borders. After his playing days, he moved into coaching. He took charge of Denmark and led them to the silver medal at the 1908 Olympics, guiding a side that beat France 9-0 and then 17-1 before losing the final 2-0 to Great Britain. Then he moved into another pioneering role. In 1911, Fluminense hired him in Rio de Janeiro, making him the first long-term professional coach in Brazilian football. He won the Rio Championship with them, and later managed the first Fla-Flu Derby in 1912, and spent the rest of his life deeply tied to football in Brazil. So the first goalkeeper scorer in Football League history did not vanish into a footnote. He became part of football's global migration story, from Kent to Woolwich, from Manchester to Copenhagen, and from Copenhagen to Rio. All that belongs to the same man who, on a windy afternoon at Roker Park, kicked a ball so far and so awkwardly that it changed the record book. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 14, 1900. First, this was a real football first. Charles Williams was the first goalkeeper recorded as scoring in the Football League, and very likely the first in first-class football. Second, the goal only really makes sense when you picture football as it still was in 1900. Open grounds, exposed conditions, and a game not yet insulated from the weather. And third, Williams matters not only because he scored, but because he became one of the early international transmitters of football culture, from England to Denmark to Brazil. On this day in 1900, Charles Williams of Manchester City became Football League history's first goalkeeper to score with a wind-borne kick at Roker Park that turned a routine clearance into a landmark. That's all for episode 165 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Law Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with all your friends. Tomorrow, go to April 15, 1989, and to Hillsborough in Sheffield. See you then.